Well, yes, I don't think blood transfusion is anything remotely to do with anything that Moses or the Bible ever conceived. So you don't need to worry about that. If you're going to be dying, but for the taking in of some blood given generously by some donor, I'd go for it. Eating blood is quite a different category from taking blood to save your life in an accident. So I really think it's a misuse of Scripture to try to connect those two things. I notice that the Jehovah's Witnesses have lightened up on this quite a bit. They're allowing for some sort of blood transfusion now. So just a misconception, I would think. I don't think Paul or Moses or the Bible writers have that kind of procedure in mind at all. Well, they're talking about kosher foods there, I would think, quite clearly, because some of these people are still attending the synagogue and they're hearing about kosher foods. Now, you don't want to offend a Jew who's weak at that point. Now, the whole issue of foods, of course, is very clear in Paul. It took these people a while to get used to this. James was perhaps a little bit slower than Paul, who got there first. Peter was slower. He had to be rebuked by Paul to get this right. But the issue of food is very clear. In Romans 14, Paul instructs us not to be hasty, impatient with people who are vegetarians. That's their conviction. They're new to the faith. Don't make that the issue that keeps them away from the faith. Some people drink wine, some don't. Those are not issues to be tackled right at the start. But Paul is very clear that we are to become strong as he is strong. So in Romans 14, this is the clincher, Romans 14 verses 14 and 20, you have this. I, Paul, he's speaking about himself, I, Paul, and note he's a Jew, and note he's a Christian, a true Christian, I am convinced that nothing is unclean of itself. I simply put it to you that nobody in his senses could write that way if he's trying to enforce the Levitical food laws. It's just impossible. I, Paul, the Christian and believer, am convinced in my own mind that nothing is unclean of itself unless you think it's unclean. At which point then your conscience is weak. You aren't there yet. Move forward in the faith. Be like Paul. Be strong. Get to the point where you are quite convinced that those food laws were not essentially health laws anyway. Even the rabbis say that. They're not distinctions that are binding in the New Testament. And then in the 20th verse of Romans 14, even more explicitly, Paul says, all things are kathara, clean. That's the opposite word to akathartos, unclean, which is listed in Leviticus 11. I mean, really, could Paul be clearer? Paul is very radical. It may take you time to come to this. Note that in Galatians, Paul says, if you get circumcised, don't do it. If you do, wrongly, then you're going to have to be obliged to keep the whole law. Now, people say, well, you're saying the whole law was done away with. We must make distinctions here. There's a law of love, loving your neighbor, loving God, and so on. The laws of chastity, against fornication, drunkenness, which are absolutely perpetual. That's quite clear. But Paul has a law in mind. Those laws which distinguish you from, as a Jew, from the rest of the world. Those are the things which you don't want to observe. Now note the radical thing that Paul has done here. In Genesis 17 it says that everybody must be physically circumcised, all the males, whether they're Jews or Gentiles wanting to be part of the covenant. They must be physically circumcised. Now notice Galatians. If you get circumcised, don't do it, he said. Please don't do it. And I'm speaking to everyone, Paul said there. Is he really saying, well, I'm talking to the Jews now I'm talking to the Jews? I don't think so. His churches are mixed with Jews and Gentiles, and he's telling all of them, we're moving past, we have moved past the old covenant stipulation of physical circumcision. We've moved into the realm of the Spirit. That takes us then to Colossians chapter 2, where Paul is very scared that people are going to adopt the Jewish calendar, the new moons, and the holy days, and the weekly Sabbath. That's the totality of the Jewish calendar. They're going to adopt that. Don't do it, Paul says. These things are a shadow, and he contrasts them negatively with the Messiah who has come. Christ is your Sabbath. Let us be keeping the feast. Doesn't mean let's be observing one festival. Let's be festivalizing on a continuing basis. That's in 1 Corinthians 5. Look at the Greek carefully there. Look at the commentaries. Your rest is in Jesus, not just one day in the week. Now it happens, of course, that the Christians observing not as a Sabbath. Sunday is not a Sabbath, that's quite true. But Sunday is a reasonable day to rest, and so you get in 1 Corinthians 16 too, every first day of the week. Note the Greek mian, feminine there, implying day. Every first day of the week, put your money in the treasury. So there will be no collections. So there will be no collections when I come. That is rather obvious that they are collecting the money in the church on every first day of the week. That's entirely reasonable. It's a falsehood to say that Constantine invented Sunday. Yes, he legislated in favor of the Christians who were keeping Sunday as a resurrection day. That's perfectly true. But Constantine did not invent that idea. So Romans 14, 14 and 20 are clinchers. Colossians 2, 16 and 17 is perfectly plain. Paul is against the shadows of the Jewish calendar.